Someday I want to go to a wax museum that's actually just a museum about the history and the different types of wax and how you can recognize them. And
Oh, it's not one of those museums where they just wax lyrically.
This time we watched Season 11, Episode 8, The Loves of Hercules.
In which there's a Hydra or a Hedra, but alas, no Ghidra.
But first, hey, you guys managed to do an episode without me.
Yeah.
Sort of.
Yeah, I'm still sore about that because that means I watched Lords of the Deep instead of coming up with an excuse to get out of it, to bail.
In my defense, I watched 3/4 of it.
Oof.
So maybe it got really good at the end, and I'll never...
Sure. Only our listeners know for sure.
Yeah, we're attempting my return. I have a baby near me right now. We'll see how she gets by.
Oh, well, that's very exciting. Perhaps we'll get more into that in a bit.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess also in news, for fans of parasocial relationships and stalking, Chris, the producer of this program, is going to be at the MST3K live shows in Brooklyn later this month. So if you're going to be there, you know who to kidnap.
Chris, what neighborhood of Brooklyn is that in?
that is in the Brooklyn neighborhood of Brooklyn.
Oh.
Is it at the Bell House?
That's what I was wondering.
Yeah, because it's like everything I've seen in Brooklyn, I've seen at the Bell House.
Or at Gowanus.
It'll be at the King's Theater in Flatbush.
Flatbush. I agree. That's far out of there.
Well, that's very exciting. You will be able to say goodbye to Joel, unless he needs money, in which case there'll be another goodbye tour.
Just as a warning to everybody, there is a baby nearby, so you might hear some baby noises throughout.
Mm-hmm.
Try to keep them to a minimum, but she is only 2 months old, so she's hard to control.
Well, I mean, I think listeners are trained, with how they were raised by pop culture. They know that baby on board, something Burt Ward.
What do you think, kiddo? You gonna say something? Here we go. Well, instead of the baby, maybe we should talk about this movie.
Yes, we'll move from your labor to a man who has done many more, and I assume he had a kid as one of his labors. He was the first pregnant man, like Junior. But yes, let's do the Loves of Hercules. This time we watched Season 11, Episode 8, The Loves of Hercules. Now, Hercules' wife is killed while he's away, and he asks an oracle if anything bad will happen to him after he completed all of his labors. And sadly, one of Herc's pals arrives on the scene to inform Hercules and company that he's just freshly single and ready to mingle. And the old survivor informs Herc that the attack was staged by one Eurytus. Anyway, that none of this matters. I'm not going to pretend that there was much of a plot here. It was just a series of Jayne Mansfield wigs, the world's safest bullfight, and an amazing sequence with a certain scene-stealing serpent. The end.
Meanwhile, on the satellite of love, Jonah and the bots are watching Wings. You know, Wings? That 90s show that was on for, holy crap, 8 seasons? There were 172 episodes of Wings? That's a lot of wings. After the credits, it's time for the invention exchange. Also, it's Turkey Day? And let's say you want to deep fry your turkey, but you also don't want to cause a huge splash that will burn everyone in the kitchen. Tom's got the answer for you. Set up the turkey on one of those carnival dunk tank things. Just throw a baseball at the target and sink the birdie. Jonah is disturbed by treating the dead turkey like a human. Meanwhile, on Moon 13, Kinga and Max offer a Mexican jumping beanbag chair, but Max has given it a good cleaning and killed all the moth larvae that make a jumping bean jump. So now it's more of a collective moth body bag chair. In the next segment, Jonah is tied to a stake and the bots catapult various things at him. If he gets hit by the catapulted spaghetti, then the gods have declared him guilty, guilty, guilty. It worked in the movie, and it works here too. At the halfway point, Tom and Crow debate whether it was right for Herc to slay that Hydra. Crow thinks Hydras are gross, and we're better off without them. Tom recognizes that they have an important place in the ecosystem. Jonah incites them to get more and more strident in their positions. He's like a human Twitter. In the next segment, everybody's all dressed up in togas and playing at ancient Greece, when suddenly, what's this? After so many decades, a new robot is introduced? Yes, it's M. Waverly. But don't get too attached. Tom and Crow are filled with the jealousy of an only child once a new baby is brought home and swiftly tear him to pieces. Finally, in honor of the music that closes the movie out, everybody starts screaming at the top of their lungs with various degrees of musicality. Nice work, Kinga.
That's true. I think she's probably the only one who has ever been paid to sing. Unless there are songs in Ratatouille that I've forgotten about.
This was a really good movie.
I wasn't expecting that.
No, Well, I mean, I would say the movie itself is still direct, but it's the best Hercules movie I've ever seen. And I thought the jokes were great, and the segments made me laugh. And yeah, I thought this was a really good one. And I was surprised because I didn't hear much argle-blargle about this particular episode. Doesn't seem to be one of the favorites from this particular run. But I really enjoyed it. Doesn't sound like you did, though.
No. Well, I had an interesting experience. It's an interesting kind of coincidence. So, on the Megaphonic podcast, a part of our Scaritage, which myself and my co-host look at Canadian horror movies, we have decided stupidly to go through all 4 prom night movies. And as it turns out, Beth, contrary to popular belief, Prom Night 3 is the worst movie ever made. And as such, myself and my co-host Sarah were so beaten down that we found ourselves really appreciating Prom Night 4. And I bring that up here because I would say that Lords of the Deep was one of the, I think, weakest episodes of the new series. Mm-hmm. And when I had originally watched this episode, I kind of didn't think hide nor hair of it. Like, it was fine. It wasn't bad. But I didn't come away with a strong opinion. I mainly wanted to talk about this particular episode because it was so colorful. But when we finally got around to it and we saw it like right on the heels of Lords of the Deep, I'm just thinking it's like, man, this is a great episode. It's got like a colorful movie, and it was okay, and it's so much better than the last thing I watched. So I don't know. I have a certain fondness for it, even though it is not outstanding.
I think maybe a lot of the reason this was a better Hercules movie than what we've seen in the past is because of Mickey Hargitay and the fact that he was allowed to do his own dubbing, and he's Hungarian, not Italian.
I guess being Italian is like always being hypnotized.
And he has a really strong accent, and it's not, the most mature level of humor, but I really enjoy whenever they pretended to be Mickey Hargitay, particularly the part where he uses a tree to try to break down the door, and he can just, like, the actor can barely hold it aloft, and they kind of talk around that. I thought was hilarious. Basically, anytime he held anything aloft, they just made so much hay of that, and he does it quite frequently.
Yeah, I'm surprised they thought he was Italian. What with the common Italian name Hargitay, I kept expecting him to be called by Nell, who would say Hargitay, tay in the wind. Beth, do you remember the leak? Do you remember I'm not referring to your new baby, but do you remember the list that came out that had all the episodes on it? That like came out 2 weeks before season 11 premiered?
Yes, I do. Wasn't that Paste Magazine?
Well, I just remember seeing it on Reddit. There was like an actual picture of a grocery list that had a bunch of titles on it.
Oh, okay.
And one was just listed Hercules, and I got extremely excited because there is a 1980s Hercules from the director of Star Crash, starring Lou Ferrigno.
I did not know that.
It's amazing. It's one of the most entertaining things I've ever watched. There was a review in a rare IMDb review that was completely accurate. The rating of, I believe, 6 out of 10 said, this movie looks like it was directed by a gay 8-year-old. A very accurate assessment. I mean, yeah, it's fun to watch. And I guess getting back to all that is that it has a huge advantage that the Comedy Central Hercules is lacked, because those were all shot in widescreen, and they had, at the very least, the ones that Mario Bava worked on would have excellent cinematography and lighting. But we don't really get to see that because they all looked like they were hidden in the same salt mine that E.T. for Atari was hidden in. So they all look terrible. And it's kind of a shame. So at least with this movie, you can really appreciate it. And I will say that Hydra fight is excellent.
Amazing. The Hydra looks like a 3-headed mirror image of a luck dragon, like a negative image. It's cute.
It's very much like the puppeteers from The Neverending Story got work on a season of HR Puffin stuff.
Yeah, like, it's really cute.
Yeah, I was rooting for him.
I mean, he can't do much more than wave his head around, and occasionally somebody will go underneath one of his claws and pretend to be trapped. But it was one of my favorite monsters that we've seen so far. He's just like an adorable little puppy. Mm-hmm. I would say that if you're going to check out a Hercules movie, this is the one to start with.
But remember when somebody did that HD version of Manos, The Hands of Fate?
Right, yeah.
Where they subbed in the remastered footage of like the Blu-ray of the film with the MST3K overlay.
Oh, I didn't know they did that.
Oh yeah, it's incredible. So you have the episode looking exactly as it did in terms of the host segments, and I guess the quality of the Shadowrama theater footage, looking almost the same as it was on Rhino VHS. But the movie is in like shockingly, I don't want to say beautiful, but certainly clear color. And I really hope somebody does that with Hercules Against the Moon Man, because there's some sights in Hercules Against the Moon Man that I would love to see clearly. I guess that brings us to whom Jonah referred to as the thinking man's Betty Page, Jayne Mansfield.
Right. I just want to mention, plugging another podcast, but you must remember this has a very good episode on Jayne Mansfield as part of its Dead Blondes series. Are you familiar with it?
That's funny. So I've heard several episodes of that, and you must remember this is a great podcast. But I haven't listened to that one yet. It got to the point where it's like, oh, I'm just about to record on Jayne Mansfield. For whatever reason, I was like, oh, I probably shouldn't listen to that. I'll just keep reading about her.
Well, hopefully we can provide different perspectives then. One of the takes that I thought that the podcast had was that she, and Jonah might have been referring to this in his Thinking Man's Betty Page, but that she was like a self-aware bombshell. Like, she knew what she was doing. So she decided to go to Hollywood on her own and had full plans of just playing like a dumb blonde. That was going to be her shtick. And she actively pursued it and was quite ruthless about it, apparently. So you have to think of her as somebody who's like a kind of willful parody of Marilyn Monroe.
But at that point, you have to think is that if she was kind of cashing in on an ironic version of what was popular, what with Marilyn Monroe and Mamie Van Doren, why then is she trying so hard to be a serious actress here? And I think failing pretty miserably.
My understanding is that she came to the dumb blonde aesthetic a little bit too late. That idea of ultra femininity being this like squeaky, bubbly, curvy, goofy blonde was very a very 50s thing, and she just had kind of the misfortune of jumping onto it when it was going out of style. Like, she ended up hanging out with the Beatles, and they were very awful to her. And Paul McCartney ended up calling her an old bag or something like that. So, well, she's still kind of taking advantage of the fact that, the Hercules movies were famously meant to show off a lot of skin.
Which we also, again, this is totally Mickey Hargitay's movie in that sense. Because there's not much attempt even, I think, to show Mansfield off as someone with a lot of sex appeal. I know there's a scene in which she gets undressed in front of a veil, but even that is shot with remarkable indifference. So it's very, very strange to me.
It is because, oh, I'm sorry, sweetheart. I startled her. She's getting sleepy. It is kind of strange too because, well, not strange, but it's interesting to notice that the kind of diaphanous sheaths that Greek women apparently wore doesn't really work with her body type very well. Like, it doesn't really show off the goods in a way that, you know, she is attempting and say The Girl Can't Help It. You know, where it's just like hugging every single curve.
Right.
So it's interesting because it doesn't, you know, different looks work for different body types.
Hey, speak for yourself. Nothing works for this body type.
For instance, I probably would have looked the best in the 70s because everybody was kind of willowy and flat looking. that's very much my aesthetic.
I see.
If I hadn't known it was Jayne Mansfield, I don't think I would have recognized her at all.
No, but also, like, from what I've seen of Mansfield, she doesn't put off a whole hell of a lot. Although now I'm just thinking about, you know, what looks work for different eras, and I'm desperately, feverishly, Beth, trying to think of what period in which a man could really be seen as sexy if he looks like late period Ralph Bakshi. But she doesn't have a lot going on. I think if she, the trouble with potentially kind of like combing over like how she was, as if to say, it's like, you may have thought she was a dumb blonde, but in fact she was quite shrewd. It's like, well, you have her public image, which was cultivated or not, and then you have the fact that it's like when you see her in movies, she is a blank slate. So I found myself, just because of almost like a bad first impression, almost thinking it's like, I'm not sure that's true. Just sort of thinking poorly of her because she's just awful in everything I've seen her in. And plus, when you see that great photo of her and Sophia Loren, which I don't even need to explain because everybody knows it, you're immediately like, Sophia Loren, hero.
Just for people who don't know it, Jayne is at a party with Sophia Loren, and she's wearing a very deep-cut dress, and so deep that a little nipple just kind of falls out, and Sophia Loren is looking down at it, directly at it, with a look of... How would you describe that look?
I believe the word stink eye was invented specifically for this photo.
Yeah, she did not approve.
Utter revulsion, and it's... I can't help but love it. Because there's Jayne Mansfield, tacky as hell. And there's Sophia Loren, who is not having it and can't hide her disgust. I was like, oh, I find Sophia Loren's reaction so weirdly relatable. It's like, oh, that's how I feel about life in general, is just her disdain towards Jayne Mansfield.
Well, and I wouldn't say, like, I'm trying to make her out to be this super intelligent person, although she apparently did quite well in school. It's more that... she had identified a trope and decided to fit herself into it as well as she could.
Yeah, and perhaps McCartney's comments was in reference to how she looked in this movie. She would have looked like an old bag.
Oh, that's mean.
And, well, think about it, because she is wearing baggy clothes. You said it yourself. And that would have inspired McCartney's hit song, Paper Bag Writer.
Apparently John Lennon secretly peed in her drink.
Oh, that's gross.
Yeah, that's John Lennon for you. Wife beater John Lennon.
But what verification do we have of that?
He apparently told people.
Oh. But I guess one of the things that I found kind of interesting is, so we're not exactly at the very, very end of Mansfield's career in 1960, but she also is on borrowed time in that she would die in 67.
Quite horribly, too.
Yeah. They you know, they say drowning is the worst way to go, Beth, but I don't know. Horrible car wreck, I think, is much, much worse. Now, the thing that I was kind of drawn to is the kind of rumors that had been swirling around since her death, that in her final years, Mansfield was drawn into this seductive world of Anton LaVey's Church of Satan.
Really? I hadn't heard that.
Yes, and that she had, in fact, become a card-carrying Satanist.
Oh.
Well, at least that's the premise for a documentary called Mansfield 66-67. And unfortunately, two things. One, almost all of this it came out of gossip from Mansfield's hairdresser after she died.
Yeah.
So you know it's horse. And there's not even, at the very least, the film makes no attempt to find a corroborating source. So at least there isn't even like the pretense that this is anything other than gossip. But boy, what an irritating film! I would not recommend it.
Is that the one with Schwarzenegger?
No. Well, although I will get to that because I watched that as well. No, with this, there's just a bunch of folks who like celebrity gossip, of which only one is entertaining. Is it Kenneth Anger? Of course not. It's John Waters.
Oh.
Because John Waters loves gossip and he loves murder. And she was murdered by a car. Which is... or a killer who would leave no fingerprints. But Waters is extremely entertaining, and unfortunately when you watch Mansfield 66, 67, you're left really craving a John Waters documentary about this.
Yes.
And not some rando. Let me ask you something. Have you ever seen that wonderful documentary about Tammy Faye Baker?
No.
Okay. There's a great, I believe it's called The Eyes of Tammy Faye. And it, rather than telling the serio-comic life of Tammy Faye Baker exclusively, it will create these little chapters with little high-pitched voiced puppets, because Tammy Faye is so camp that it's like, well, we really have to amp that up too. The movie has to be like that. And it's really just irritating. This movie is that times a million. So whereas Eyes of Tammy Faye, I would recommend, it's like, oh, but be advised, you're going to be annoyed every 15 minutes. This is like that consistently. Except for when John Waters is on screen, and then it's riveting. But yes, the Mansfield, I guess, made enough of an impression that there was a TV movie about her where Arnold Schwarzenegger played Mickey Hargitay.
Perfect.
And it's amazing. But it's Loni Anderson who plays Jayne Mansfield.
Huh.
Another famous blonde. But donning a big Loves of Hercules wig for the early scenes. The film gets off to a fantastic start when Arnold Schwarzenegger, with gray in his hair, as an older Hargitay, is looking through photo ops and old memories of Mansfield. And there's a photo of Loni with a chimp. And Schwarzenegger says, like, many of her early promotions were done with monkeys. And I was just like, 10 out of 10, fantastic movie. Schwarzenegger has the doofy charm that one would associate with early Schwarzenegger. He speaks like he has a mouthful of razor blades, which is not inaccurate to Hargitay's performance here.
Exactly.
And so he's perfectly cast. And from what I understand, Schwarzenegger did have a certain admiration for Hargitay, who was like a Mr. Universe way back when. But Loni Anderson is terrific.
Really?
Yeah, and it's like, here's the thing. Loni Anderson has gotten very few chances in life to be good at something.
She has not. She is definitely somebody who seems like someone who would have been underestimated.
Yes, because if anyone who either has old memories or freshly rewatched memories of WKRP, it's like she's like brilliant. She's a genuinely great comic actress, playing the opposite of the dumb blonde on that show, save for one episode where the characters pretend to be silly to scare somebody away from buying the station or something. I forget. But she, aside from WKRP, nobody knew really how to write for her. So she was always cast as almost like the poor man's Heather Locklear, which was such a waste. Because she had this amazing comic timing, and she had real presence and real charisma, and she had all of that combined with what might have been kind of perfect for the 70s and 80s, but this kind of comical, in a way, action figure sex pot body. Like, she looks like Jessica Rabbit. But despite all of that, despite having all the talent, and despite having really the right look for the time, she also didn't fit for whatever reason.
Yeah, like the only thing I remember about her really is she was Mad Magazine fodder for her relationship with...
with Bert.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's basically how I came to know who she was.
But yeah, I think that I've enjoyed at least some of the things that have come out of that, especially that this movie has two really fun performances that I wasn't expecting. I was not expecting the screen to light up when Loni Anderson meets Arnold Schwarzenegger. But the film is just lovely.
Hercules, Anthony, Jupiter, you get back here. We have to go school shopping for you today.
Hercules. A man of many things. Loves, labors, lusts, I presume. But Beth, you're something of an expert on myth. What can we learn that we haven't learned from all of this, and how true it is to the legends of Hercules and his legendary journeys?
We've talked about him before, and I think what is most relevant for this particular movie is that it kind of sets up that he has just finished the 12 labors.
Mm-hmm.
And so he, in this movie at least, is looking like he's suggesting to the Oracle, like, hey, I've done everything I could. We're good, right? And the Oracle's like, no, because it is your destiny to basically live on the waves or something, but basically to have a tumultuous life, which I guess gives some justification for why his wife gets killed off in every single rendition of this movie. He gets to go on to a new love. Mm-hmm. Because, yes, it starts with his wife being slain, and then that's the end of it, basically. He doesn't really seem to mind either way. But what started this whole adventure is that his wife, Megara, is that how you say it, Chris? Megara?
I think Megara, but yeah.
Megara. He killed his children and Megara in a fit of madness, and he had to do the 12 labors of penance, which is ironic because it wasn't his fault that he was driven mad. He was driven mad by the gods.
Yeah. Admittedly, the only thing that made it look bad is when Hercules tried to escape in that white Bronco.
And I admire this movie for at least using that as something to build on, in terms of, like, he is kind of like a Greek Lone Ranger. You know, he just moves from town to town doing what he can, and he's kind of driven by the gods to never be tranquil.
And I guess not unlike Batman, whose life is defined by tragedy.
Although you'd think that he'd figure out, like, maybe I should stop marrying ladies because the gods are just going to kill them off anyway. It's kind of not fair to them.
But he's the ultimate man, Beth. He has ultimate manly desires.
To some extent. I don't think that's what classically he was known for.
No, he's not known for his big hog.
He was known for being dumb and strong, basically. Which, you know, he covers those bases fairly well, but I don't think he was ever really known as a lover.
Oh, he totally was.
Mm-hmm. Okay, clarify.
As you said, he got married several times. In this movie, he meets his third wife, and the one that eventually kills his mortal half, sort of accidentally, sort of not. But in his stories, he would keep hooking up with people, and he was seen as indeed somewhat of a lover boy.
Now, it's interesting you mentioned it's like, all right, so a marriage that is always ending badly, multiple marriages, a third wife who killed his mortal half. Are we sure that we're talking about Hercules and not Larry King?
Man, you love that guy.
I do. I've done my 12 labors. Gary from Halifax, hello.
It just seems like Hercules is like the ultimate boomer, you know?
Okay. There's a lot of weird tweets that he's making, I guess.
Because there has never been a generation that gets married and remarried as much as boomers. So Hercules is like our dads.
Well, my dad certainly had a great Steve Reeves beard, which is what I think of when I think of Hercules. If I see a Hercules and he don't look like no Jonathan Frakes riding a bicycle telling me that everything I believe was wrong, then I tend not to think it's really Hercules, even though Mickey Hargitay was a pretty good Hercules. I really enjoyed him.
Yeah. But it's true. Classically, Hercules had a very, very luscious beard.
Yes, and I'm glad that proved to be true, because that was the first thing I wanted to know about Hercules when I actually looked into the myths, is that I was like, all right, how much of the 60s cartoon was real? And it turns out all of it. But like, amazingly, it's like that's what my dad had in common with him, but also my dad had a habit of walking around nude in the house, flexing and turning to me and saying, the bod, which I also think is very Hercules Hercules thing to do.
So last night I was leafing through, as you do, my copy of Plutarch's Erotikos, the dialogue on love. It's sort of like Plato's Symposium, but a lot loosey-gooseier in terms of where it's going with everything.
Emphasis on goosey.
Yeah, it's a story of a lot of people basically arguing about what is love, who's the best person to love, should love be sexy, should love not be sexy, is it better to love boys or girls or women or what, or men, or slaves, should you have sex with your slaves, is it right to love slaves, things like that.
I think that's an article on Breitbart right now.
Exactly. And Hercules comes up a couple times in it. They even say, as for Hercules, it would be difficult to list all his loves, they are so numerous.
Wow.
Yeah. But importantly, Hercules, at least according to Plutarch, didn't just love women. He also got down with some dudes, including Iolaus. Now, I don't know if you remember Iolaus from the film. He's the old man who's hanging out with them with the kind of Smurf hat.
Oh.
Yeah, awesome.
Yeah. So in the tradition, Hercules totally tapped that. But not only that, so Iolaus is like his right-hand man. He's charioteer. He's just sort of his Gal Friday. I don't know. But not only does he allegedly have sex with him, to the point that, according to Plutarch, even now, centuries later, men go to Iolaus's grave in order to exchange vows of fidelity and love to one another.
Huh.
But also, after Hercules killed his first wife's children, killed Megara's children, and got so upset about it because he didn't mean to. He was driven mad by the gods when he did it. He couldn't really handle being around Megara anymore because it just reminded him of the terrible thing that he had done.
Fair enough.
So he gave her as a wife to Iolaus.
As you do.
As you do. But you think, that doesn't really solve the problem because now this woman that I can't bear to be around is my charioteer's wife. The dude I'm f***ing. So...
Yeah, but the separation of the genders was pretty strong in ancient Greece, so I get the sense that she'd just be tucked away in a house and never seen from again.
That's true. You don't take the wife on your road trips when you're going and doing a bunch of labors and a bunch of other quests.
Yeah, especially when you're too busy f***ing an old man.
So Herc slept with a lot of people, a lot of women, a lot of men. Maybe some goats, I don't know. Maybe a hydra or two.
He was a regular Frank Langella.
But is there anyone in particular that you think, like if you had to create the ideal mate for Hercules, who would you go for? What sort of characteristics?
An Amazonian queen.
He did sleep with several of those.
Yeah, there were a few. But I don't get the sense that Hercules, he's unchained, right? He can't stay with anyone for very long.
He's also against the Moon Man, and he finds some haunted women at one point, or captive women, sorry. I'd say with Hercules, it's like the obvious pairing is the person who stood out the most as a companion to Conan the Barbarian, which of course was Grace Jones in Conan the Destroyer. I can see Grace Jones and Hercules working out.
I just don't think he's the type to stick down with anybody for any length of time. He is serially monogamous.
Hey everybody, it's time for the Shallow 13.
It's time for the Shallow 13. 13 tidbits about the Loves of Hercules. Go, Beth, go!
The Loves of Hercules was directed by Carlo Ludovico Brigaglia, who got his start in the 30s. He made a name for himself directing a series of comedies with famous Italian comic actor Toto. But alas, the movie came at the end of his career and his powers had begun fading. He would retire from directing a few years later with 1963's The Three Musketeers.
On the other hand, Toto, real name Antonio Griffo Focus Flavio Ducas Comenos Gagliardi de Curtis of Byzantium, His Imperial Highness, Palatine Count, Knight of the Holy Roman Empire, Exarch of Ravenna, Duke of Macedonia and Illyria, Prince of Constantinople, Sicilia, Thessaly, Pontus, Moldavia, Dardania, and Peloponnesus, Count of Cyprus and Epirus, Count and Duke of Dravasto and Durazzo, would go on to battle Italy's favorite Hercules wannabe in 1962's Toto vs. Maciste.
Moira Orfei plays Nemea, an Amazon woman who helps Herc out of the Amazon Queen's clutches. Orfei had a long career as an actress, but perhaps more interesting, she came from circus folk. Orfei was born into a circus family, married an acrobat, and would perform in the big top to some capacity for most of her life. In 1969, Orfei and her husband decided to jazz up their company's shows by offering an alternative to traditional circus. And yes, you know what that means. The Cerco, Moira, or Fey popularized those three words Misty's fear most of all. Circus on ice.
In an interview years later, Moira Orfei said that she was annoyed that Jayne Mansfield was the star of the film and not her. So she gave the Italian crew suggestions on how to film her, trying to ensure Jayne looked as unflattering as possible. Did it work? Well, probably not. But when the movie came out in Italy, Jayne's name wasn't on the poster, and Moira got second billing.
The film mostly uses the Italian names for our Greek characters, and so Philoctetes becomes
Philotetti.
Yes, Philotetti.
This seems to have caused some confusion for whoever created the subtitles for Netflix. Deianira's suitor's name is consistently transcribed as Achilles, but his name in the movies is Achillo, which in English is Achelous.
But to be fair, the movie itself is pretty confused about all this Greek stuff. I mean, Herc's dad is called by his Roman name Jupiter as well as his Greek name Zeus, and the cast can't agree on whether it's a Hydra or a Hedra. Whatever, it's a Peplum movie. You didn't buy tickets for a thoughtful treatment of the Greek myths. You're here to see a beefy guy pretend to whack a Hydra with a sword.
There were two different English vocal tracks prepared for today's experiment. The key difference between the two versions of the film is that one version dubbed over Mickey Hargitay's thick Hungarian accent. Luckily, MST3K blessed us by using the version with Hargitay's suspect line delivery.
Speaking of dub jobs, this wouldn't be the first or last Hercules film with multiple English language versions. As mentioned in our episode on Hercules Unchained, there were several different versions of Steve Reeves' 50s epic. And Arnold Schwarzenegger would be given the Hargitay treatment when he played the mythical strongman in the 1970 film Hercules Goes Bananas. Yes, that's the real title. Luckily, Hercules Goes Bananas was given a DVD release worthy of Criterion, as it gives viewers the option of listening to Schwarzenegger's creakiest line readings or a dub job that wouldn't sound out of place in a Godfrey Ho movie.
But the Schwarzenegger connections don't end there. Towards the end of the film, Tom cries,
Crush your enemies, see them driven before you, hear the lamentation of the women.
Arnold offers this as a response to the question, what is best in life, when he plays the titular Conan the Barbarian in 1982.
During the bullfight, Tom quips,
Russ Meyer presents Ferdinand the Bull as you've never seen him.
Russ Meyer, of course, is the director of such voluptuously violent movies as Faster Pussycat Kill, Kill. Ferdinand the Bull is a character in a children's story about a bull who would rather smell flowers than fight in a bullfight. The bull, or possibly bulls, in today's movie, are disinterested in putting up much of a fight, less out of pacifism, and more because they're highly sedated.
When a group of archers brandish their bows and arrows, Tom asks,
Any fruit to declare?
This riff is a callback. They made the same joke about the random armed fascists in Warrior of the Lost World, which we covered on episode 14 of It's Just a Show.
Warrior of the Lost World marked the first appearance of, you guessed it, Donald Pleasance on MST3K. Now, did he ever star in a Hercules movie? No. Unless you count 1975's The Devil Within Her, in which Joan Collins is cursed by a sadistic dwarf named Hercules to give birth to a horrible child. Pleasance, as Collins' ill-fated doctor, is decapitated by magic baby powers fairly early on.
Capitalizing on the best, or if you prefer, silliest part of today's movie, The Loves of Hercules was released on DVD with a far more promising title, Hercules vs. the Hydra.
And that's time.
So last time you went and did my corner segment without me, Chris.
Well, somebody had to.
You didn't sound too enthused about it, if I'm being perfectly honest.
To be fair, I was far less enthused, which is why Chris did it.
Well, let's try to bring it back then. Let's talk about the marble columns in this movie. The corner.
Ooh, the segment is back from the dead after being in the wrong hands, not unlike Community Season 5.
So, when you think of the art and of the statuary of ancient Greece and Rome, what do you think about Adam?
In terms of that, well, I mean, when I think of ancient Rome, I just think of busts of hairy men. Wouldn't you?
Busts of hairy men?
Yeah.
How do they depict hairiness?
Well, I don't know. It's just a big beard.
True. But what is the color you most associate with those ancient Greek statues?
Oh, I mean, I don't know. I would say they're pearly white. Are they not?
What if I told you that they were never pearly white?
Gasp! I've been lied to.
I'm going to put a picture in our Slack. Tell me what you think about it.
All right.
All right, there it is.
Wait, that's a picture from Toy Story. It's extremely colorful, but that's not how it was it?
Apparently.
Oh.
Now, there's still some debates over this, but it is almost certainly the case that most of the ancient Greek statuary was very colorfully painted, and that the architecture, too, would have been very strong colors. Not unlike the rest of the ancient world, the Greeks and the Romans were crazy about color.
Really? And yeah, you look at this stuff, and 70s cookbooks don't look this colorful.
Now, this was from an exhibition that went around about 10 years ago, and a lot of people found it very disconcerting because it is, by our eyes, quite tacky. But there's some suggestion that, well, first of all, these were plaster recreations, and paint kind of sits differently on marble. It absorbs a little bit more, and that the colors that they're trying to reproduce are probably a lot stronger than they were actually capable of at the time. But nonetheless, they would have been heavily colored like this. And the New Yorker, and I'll post it in our show notes, has a really fascinating article about how the belief about the whiteness of statues kind of came up at the same time as the belief in the whiteness of Greeks and Romans, and therefore of civilization.
Okay.
Because the paint faded after thousands of years, obviously, and especially when the stuff tended to be exhumed. When they cleaned it off, the paint would come with it, but the paint was still there, usually in like crevices like ears and noses, and people kind of deliberately ignored the fact that there was evidence of paint, because this idea of Greece and Rome having this strange kind of all-white aesthetic, which was very different from the rest of the ancient world, like the Egyptians and the Phoenicians and things like that, made them seem exceptional, right? That they had like a higher aesthetic than what was around at the time. But no, they were part of the ancient world, so they had very similar aesthetics.
Wow. Okay. I mean, I guess that adds up, but still, I'm shocked by this image, which, like I said, is colorful, like it's something from one of the toys at a Toy Story.
Yes, exactly. And marble columns, I'll see if I can find an example of what the architecture would look like. But I mean, okay, I'm going to go into professor mode here a little bit, but the construction of whiteness, which mostly happened in the 18th and 19th centuries, required a revision of history that meant that people had to deliberately ignore evidence that it wasn't that way. So, for instance, with the painting, like there was lots of evidence that Greek and Roman statues did have painting on them. In fact, there are depictions on urns of Greek workers painting their statues. They just ignore that, just don't mention it really, because it doesn't fit the narrative. But it is also the case that Greece and Rome were not white.
Ooh.
They're not white people.
Of course.
Well, for Greeks especially, they first of all, the idea of race is a construction, and they mostly focused on ethnicity and culture. That's how they kind of differentiated people. It doesn't mean that they weren't xenophobic, but that they kind of worked on a different idea. But when they got close to racial theory, it was kind of based on the humors, right? So their view was that white people, and this would be like Germans and Gauls, right? Because they were so far north and their blood was so heavy, they were very, very brave and very, very stupid.
Not unlike Hercules.
And then, on the other hand, the Ethiopians, who had very dark skin, they said because they were more of a sanguine kind of environment, that they were extremely intelligent but also quite cowardly. And then you have Greeks, who are right in the middle, so they were perfect, right?
Of course.
They would have been horrified to be associated with white, because the ultimate man was a dark, bronzed, godlike figure, right? The women would be expected to have lighter skin because they would be indoors all the time, but then you have this real gender divide for skin rather than racial.
Interesting.
And meanwhile, the Roman Empire was huge. It went from Scotland to North Africa, and so their elites were pulled from all over the world. So you can see in a lot of, not so much the statuary, but in like Roman frescoes and things like that, there's all sorts of colors. They did not differentiate by skin at all, which really bothers a lot of white supremacists who want to be able to trace back their heritage to ancient Greece and Rome. Sorry, guys, it doesn't work that way.
Well, that might be difficult to explain for all those bronze-skinned, extremely muscular white supremacists.
Yeah, so I mean, there's examples of this all over the internet. If you put in like ancient Greece and Rome and color, you'll see a lot of examples of the kinds of dyes that they likely used. And I got into this topic because there's a really, really impressive shot in this movie of a marble colonnade that looks extremely huge. I'm not sure how they do that. Is that a matte painting that they're able to walk into or something like that?
Oh, you know what? I'm not quite sure. I imagine that it's a painting extended by a set. So
They film it from two different angles. So I'm kind of thinking I don't know whether it would have been real or not, but I don't know.
It seems pretty huge. But anyway, a lot of its kind of majesty comes from the fact that it's all white, this kind of pristine, ghostly look to it. But if you were walking through Rome, you would have just been assaulted by color. It would have been an absolute carnival. In fact, one of the reasons that they painted statuary is they liked the effect of being tricked. Again, the article describes like you'd be sitting down and you would beckon to a slave boy, but the slave boy would end up being a statue, and then the actual slave boy comes and fills your drink, and they really enjoyed that kind of like trompe l'oeil effect. So that was what those statues were really meant for in a lot of ways.
Oh wow!
But isn't it weird? Like foundationally, you think of ancient Greece and Rome as just being all unpainted marble, right? That's not what it was like at all. It's just amazing how these like falsities just get built into the way we think of our history.
Yes, well, perhaps scholars and history buffs take the Greeks and Romans more seriously than the Greeks and Romans did.
That is probably true.
The mountaintops with on top, lemon yellow sun.
Remind me, Adam.
Hmm?
There's a lot of Pearl Jam singing.
Mm-hmm.
What triggers that?
Well, if you thought that maybe I looked into this after expressing bafflement about it on the Slack, you'd be wrong, because I did not care. I know they sing Even Flow, I believe, a few times, but really my knowledge of Pearl Jam is limited to the fact that they are the first band I'm aware of that I would classify as being in the genre of Hunger Dang. And you know exactly what I mean.
Yeah,
It's the guy who does that. But so like I didn't have an interest in the jam. Did you? When you're in your days of pure moods?
Well, before I answer that, Chris, could you remind us what was the lead into this joke? Because I was there, but I didn't catch it.
I have no idea, but I guess it's the sort of thing that a muscle dude might sing as he's walking to the gates of a town. He doesn't look like Vedder or anything. He doesn't even particularly look like what I tend to think a Pearl Jam fan stereotypically looks like. So I did not get this joke.
All right, we'll leave it out to the fans to maybe clarify that for us. But in any case, he does a good impression. Although I have to say, it's not very hard to do that impression. Mm-hmm. Like I can do it right now. Even flow.
I think that's Ethel Merman. Beth, I think what you were looking for was, look at this graph.
That's a different guy.
Yeah, but that's the same voice.
Yeah.
Chad Kroeger is very much a poor man's Johnny Pearl Jam.
Who else sounded like this? You had
the people from Creed, with
Creed.
arms wide open.
Arms wide open.
Yeah.
You had
of course the Pointer Sisters. I'm so excited. I just can't hurt it.
Yeah. There's a bunch, but it was very much a sound back then.
Yeah,
that was at trend, and never really liked it. No. I mean, I kind of had to pull along. Like I was a teenager, so everyone else said this was the thing to listen to, so I did. But I have to say, it hasn't aged well. If I was going to pick something from the era to bring forward, it would not be the grunge noise.
No, in fact, Pearl Jam style singing really makes you appreciate the era of Def Leppard screeching.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, that sounds a lot better to my ears, having endured like a decade and a half of Pearl Jam wannabes.
Well, that's a good way to look at it. Like, obviously, the grunge noise was a reaction to that high-pitched screaming of the 80s. Mm-hmm. And so I'm trying to think of what kind of came after grunge was very melodic boy band singing. as kind of a counterpoint.
Yeah, I mean, not to mention is that, like, at the time, like, Pearl Jam and bands that followed, even questionable bands like Creed and Nickelback, they were sort of seen as people who were giving much-needed blood back to the sound of, when people say classic rock, they really mean 70s rock. And I don't know if anyone's really carrying that on now. I think that may or may not depend on whether Wolfmother is still around, and they were really just a Led Zeppelin type band.
Well, it's hard to say because rock's dead now, so...
Well, they've been saying that for 30 years. It's like, rock has been declared dead almost as many times as SNL has been declared dead.
Well, now I would say it is definitively buried and pushing up daisies now. Because if you look at the way that the awards have been put out and what hits the charts, there's no rock and roll traditionally there anymore. There hasn't really been since the 2000s.
I suppose so, but it can recover. Because think about this, Beth. Hardcore punk music has survived the embarrassment of the most tenuous associations with pop punk.
Mm-hmm.
So you know what? I think rock can endure even more shame if it wants to come back. It'll come back when it's ready. Well, Chris, we have talked about all the love that we've had in our hearts for Hercules. Do you have one, loving or not, final factoid about this film and this episode for us?
Well, I do have a few other passages from Plutarch that I'd like to read out. But actually, what I really want to know about is, in our last episode, we were promised a story about Beth's raggedy old placenta, and yet Beth had to run off. And so now I'd like to know, can you please, Beth, tell us more about this old placenta of yours?
Chris, what is your fascination with my old placenta?
When are we going to get to the placenta factory?
Well, I think you covered it to some extent. Like, there's not much to say because it remains a mystery. Like, I gave birth. Placenta comes out right after, in case you didn't know. And there was some interest in it because my baby was IUGR, which means intrauterine growth restriction. She stopped growing in the third trimester, which is why we had to yank her out early. And that is often caused by placental failure. It just stops providing the nutrients that the baby needs. So they were wanting to examine it, but that requires them to take it off to like a lab for a couple months. So it was just like my inexpert midwife who got a look at it. I mean, not an expert, but she's not a doctor, so she's just doing like kind of a perfunctory look at it. She sees a lot of placentas, that's for sure, and she's just kind of looking at it, and she's like, "It does look old." I'm like, "Really?" And she tried to describe it like, look how it looks a bit tired, and. But I mean, I don't know my placenta from a good one from a bad one, so I'm just like, it looks like a red pancake. So, and she did the weirdest thing. She like, because they midwives can be a bit wooey, so she picks it up and she's like, you can see that it's a tree because like the striations in it kind of look very tree-like, and I'm like, okay, yeah, sure, that's neat that it kind of looks like a tree, I guess.
Did it look like an old tree?
It looked like it had a lot of rings. But they sent it off to a lab, and apparently I'm supposed to find out maybe someday whether there was anything wrong with it. But you know what? I think maybe it got lost in transit because I have not heard anything yet.
Oh, no.
I'd like to think there were just two guys carrying a placenta, but there was a high-speed chase and someone on a motorcycle crashed through it, shattering it on the streets.
I more was thinking like it was on the back of an old rickety pickup truck, and it was just kind of sitting on the top, and then it just like splats on the pavement.
I was imagining more of a Placenta's Day Out scenario where it was climbing up onto some scaffolding and getting into all sorts of
trouble. Mr. Magoo adopts it.
Exactly. That's how old a placenta it is. It's basically Mr. Magoo.
But as a result, I didn't get to eat it.
That's a shame.
Not that I was planning to, but it wasn't given as an option.
So much for trying out that lasagna recipe.
Well, I hope the listeners enjoyed that story.
Mr. Magoo would be a good name for a placenta, because presumably it is also full of goo.
And doesn't see very well.
No. And in your case, quite old.
If you've been affected by the issues on this show, if you know the whereabouts of Beth's placenta, or if you'd like to ask Beth and Adam anything, get in touch with us. Our website is itsjustashow.com, and we're on Twitter at itisjustashow. We'd love to hear from you. This show is made possible by listeners like you. For as little as $1 an episode, you can help us research and record this show, and you can listen to all our superfan bonus bits. Find out more at itsjustashow.com/Patreon or patreon.com/itsjustashow. And if you want to follow up on anything that was mentioned today, you'll find links in our show notes at itsjustashow.com/episode/55.
Well, Chris, we've chopped the heads off of this particular Hydra for now. What's coming up next?
Next is an episode that I don't know anything about. I'll tell you this, it's got Lee Majors, and it's got Burgess Meredith, and it is KTMA episode 20, The Last Chase.
A KTMA episode and Burgess Meredith, my cup runneth over.
Is this also maybe the last KTMA? That's pretty high up in terms of numbers.
No, it is not. It's the next to last.
Next to last, okay. The penultimate.
Yep, sorry. Legend of the Dinosaurs is inexplicably the last episode of KTMA.
Okay, well, I hate KTMA, but let's go for it.
Yeah, you got Burgess Meredith to look forward to. And you know what? This is one of the last KTMAs, so you're going to see it all polished and nice. You're going to see, all the stars will come out for this more recent KTMA offering. Stars like Lee Majors, for instance.
It's also about a terrible world in which all cars have been banned.
Oh, no!
I know, the horror.
If only they'd done it in 1967, Jayne Mansfield would still be alive today.
Oh.
We've been talking about boomers a lot. I couldn't think of a more boomer rendition of the apocalypse than, oh no, no cars.
Mm-hmm.
Well, on that note, until next time.
May you have many loves and many wigs.
But not purple wigs. Those are only for mourning.
Mm-hmm.
Happy Labor Day, everybody. Take it away, Theme Squad.
Just a show. And if you want to follow up on anything that was mentioned today, you'll find links in our show note at itsjustashow.com/episode/54. The episode where all the celebrities and Andy Warhol dance. Well, I think myself and you, and indeed Beth, very early on, we've done it all. We've entered foamy life for a more refreshing existence and for hopefully more refreshing episodes. Chris, what will we be discussing next time on It's Just a Show?
Well, it's that time of year again. Soon it'll be Labor Day. Not just a day to celebrate Beth and all the other people who've recently gone into labor, but workers everywhere, including the original dodecalabourer, Hercules. So let's celebrate once again with Season 11, Episode 8, The Loves of Hercules.
I wonder if Mickey Hargitay looked at Jayne Mansfield and pulled a muscle.
So are you excited to do a Season 11 one after this Season 12 episode?
Just sure, it'll be fresh. You know what? It'll be fun. And this is an unusual thinking that we'll finally be seeing a Hercules movie on this show in a good quality print. So we can probably better appreciate all the wackiness to ensue.
And all the Jayne Mansfield to vavavoom.
Mm-hmm.
I know Beth is looking forward to a little Jayne Mansfield action.
Hey, who isn't? Well, I guess the people of the last, 30 or 40 years, because she's long dead.
When did she die?
I believe it was...
67. Jesus.
Yeah.
She died quite young.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Oh
I think her and Mickey were only together for a few years. But we'll get into that and other things.
Yeah, tune in for a very sad episode of It's Just a Show next time.
Yes, we're actually going to break the news live on the air to Beth that she died.
Well, okay. Hopefully Beth will be back next time to share all that with us. I mean, she will. We're gonna make her. We're gonna make her if we have to take that baby away from her. But until next time.
Yes, it sounds like a Plansfield with Jayne Mansfield.
Come back, Beth. Okay, take it away, Theme Squad.
Well, I really should go and try to maximize how much sleep I can get. So it's good talking to you guys. Hopefully we'll do this again soon.